Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It's absolutely a pleasure and honor to be here. That's not Imam Abdullah Antepli. I wish he's much better looking, given his age. Over this very sobering topic of torture, which is one of the worst forms of moral failure in any society when it happens. But the real moral failure is when it goes unnoticed, unpunished, unrecognized, and unhealed. In the history of humanity, the people and the societies always fail, morally, ethically, and otherwise. People make mistakes. But both in Islam and many traditions that I have studied, both God and humanity, they don't judge people or societies or governments by their mistakes, but they judge them based on their responses to these mistakes. What they did in the face of this moral failure. What did they do as a society when it becomes evident, when it becomes extremely clear that this moral failure took place in our midst through our tax money, through people who are given the trust of representation of our beautiful, beautiful society. Quite honestly, there is a lower level of moral failure than torture itself, which is some of the excuses or justifications to moral flaws of torture. Like some of the responses coming from the mouth of some religious leaders, some politicians, some community leaders, in one way or another, trying to justify or explain or rationally put something into a context, somehow defend that in this society, torture could be understood or in some ways justified. I would like to explain this through a somewhat vulgar Turkish joke, which I hope will bring some humor to this somewhat very difficult and tough subject. It is difficult because I grew up in Turkey, and when I was 6 years old, there was a military coup in 1980, where my family members, my friends, and many of my relatives have been subject to extreme torture under military rule. And I lived in Myanmar for almost 6 years, another military dictatorship where many different forms. I visited Myanmar jails when I was there as a human rights worker, and I have seen the effect and impact. And coming to the United States, that really triggers, not to be too personal, I had this delusion that I don't have to deal with those kind of moral dilemmas. But it's my bad, because this is a human failure, human flaw, and therefore wherever humanity is. But I believe we are in a still much better position in our response to these moral failures. What is more morally problematic is not torture, but I think those voices who are trying to excuse us or provide excuses to torture. Here is the Turkish joke. In a dark hole of a palace, Turkish palace, a ruthless, merciless Turkish king is sexually assaulted by his king from behind. And when he turns around, he saw that one of his ministers is assaulting him sexually. And in that shock, the minister says, "Oops, I'm sorry, I thought it was your wife." I thought it was your wife. So his excuse, he was executed not because of his crime, but because of his excuse, actually why he did it, or what was his motivation to do it. So I would like to just morally condemn and denounce any excuse or justifications, which is worse than torture itself, that somehow there should be some logical, ethical, moral, religious justification or understanding. Fear could be, it's not happening here, but if you look, some of the people who brought themselves to justify torture is unfortunately, their excuse is worse than the crime itself. We have to absolutely, as this whole day and the panel represents, understand and torture within the world and within the world of moral universe. And because torture is not an isolated thing. If it happens, and especially if it happens and goes unnoticed, unpunished, unrecognized, unhealed, and unrepaired, it's an indication for a much larger, much bigger, deeply pathological cancer and tumor of that particular society. And therefore, we have every reason, every ethical, moral commitment, every religious spiritual, and ethical call to address this problem, which is evident before us. And the torture is not about victim. It's about a perpetrator. The Prophet of Islam famously says, help your brother when he is oppressed, or sister. But he continues to say, help your brother when he is an oppressor. And people around him says, it's quite logical and understandable to help somebody who is oppressed. But how do you help somebody? In a way, the Prophet of Islam calls for mercy and understanding to the perpetrators or the oppressors, because they are human beings too, and this is not going, the oppression will not only destroy the oppressed, the torture will not destroy the victims of torture, but it will morally erode and destroy the perpetrator and his and her society, his and her community, his and her religion, his and her entire universe. Therefore, we have not only moral obligations to the victims of torture, but we have moral obligation for us not to just move on, not to just turn a blind eye on these evidence, facts, and information has been received over and over here and elsewhere, and have to go back before we move forward and heal ourselves. What led us to this situation? What mechanism, what flaws, what ethical, moral, lack of muscles within us as a society? Just because it is always easy to be moral when you are not provoked, when there is no 9/11, when there is no Pearl Harbor, when there is no this and that. The test of morality is when you are provoked, when you are put in a situation. We always, of course, there is not even a need for a test of morality when everything is fine and we are going through peaceful and harmonious times. The morality of a nation comes to a test during the time of war and during the time of conflict and during the time of events, heinous, barbaric, terrorist events like 9/11 and otherwise. It is quite disheartening how much as a humanity we do not learn from our mistakes. Another Turkish joke. A Turkish joke, a Turkish person, or we call it Turkish redneck, sees a huge banana peel on his walkway. You know what he says? A slippery, huge banana peel right in front of him on his walkway. He says, shoot, I'm going to fall again. Because he's done this before. He has done this before many, many times, that he stepped on these banana peels. When he sees another one, instead of like a reasonable human being saying, we are not going to do this again, it is funny and somewhat illogical, but exactly if you look the way in which this nation, whose foundational promises and commitments are source of awe and admiration to many people around the world, it is foundational principles and commitments and ideals and its moral framework and its success in creating a multicultural, multi-religious society, which is quite significant compared to where I have lived before I became an American citizen. It is source of awe and admiration, especially this society. Therefore, it hurts more. If societies that are built in hypocrisy, authoritarianism, and dictatorship are involving these kind of stuff, it is almost like expected of them. If Egypt, if Turkey, if Myanmar is doing these kind of practices, it's almost expected of them because their foundational commitments, where they are as a society, their aspiration for all sorts of different reasons, not to put those people down. But it hurts more, it's morally more problematic that we are doing it. And we are doing it after many, many times after we saw these pitfalls and we see another one and we never learned from the previous mistakes of 1960s, 1950s, what we did throughout the Vietnam War, what we did in Korean War, what we did. And the flaw of this, because if we don't go and visit, if we don't necessarily fix and heal ourselves morally and ethically, not only it will create an incredible damage in our system, but we will repeat these mistakes. If we forget and move on, as we did for many, many times, like I am asking my fellow Americans, why so many Koreans are so angry with us? Why so many Koreans are so upset with us, both in North Korea and South Korea? I'm not trying to justify. But I've lived in that part of the world because many of them remember Korean War. In America, who remembers Korean War? Maybe Vietnam, maybe. But nobody remembers that anymore. We distance ourselves and we sort of didn't necessarily visit and learn the lessons of that moral failure of 1950s and 60s. So we can't go one more chapter of failing again, and then 10, 20 years later, once we are involved in any kind of war, both in our soils or overseas, we will see another banana peel step on it and fall again. I would like to, in the remaining 3.5 minutes, specifically talk about the torture culture, the voices trying to justify torture, or voices trying to just ignore and swipe it under the rug. What the kind of impact is happening for the Muslim community, both in the United States as well as in overseas. These kind of issues, the lack of response, ethical moral response, lack of ethical moral correction that torture issues are facing, are a prime recruitment material for evil organizations like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and otherwise. As those of us who are involved, I'm so happy to hear your voice as well. It is basically feeding the basic promise of these evil organizations, because they know they cannot defeat us militarily, because they know the primary aim of any terrorist organization, but especially Muslim terrorist organizations who are active in many different parts of the world today, they know that they cannot destroy us, but they know that through their acts of whatever they are doing, evil acts, they can destroy our social fabric. They can divide us. They can make us feel we cannot live together. They can make us feel that this war is a war between the West and the East. This is a clash of civilization between Judeo-Christian, a funny term, a Judeo-Christian Western civilization and the Muslim civilization. And our lack of moral correction, our lack of clarity in our moral correction from the torture, those voices trying to glorify, justify, or silent over this moral failure is giving aid to people who are trying to draw a black and white world where East and West are in fight, where Islam is at war with the Judeo-Christian Western civilization. Specifically, if you look, some of the lone wolves who have been homegrown terrorists, Muslim extremists and terrorists in the United States, I have, in addition to torture, I have many other masochistic interests, try to understand why these people living in the United States, living in somewhat a comfortable life, take arms against their own fellow citizens. Many of them, they have mental issues. It's not just one thing, but if you look over and over, they watch torture videos, or they watch the testimonies of students or people who have been tortured, the people who have been tortured, especially in the hands of American soldiers. This is an incredibly important psychological damage on these people, that we just aiding our enemy by lack of our moral responses to this. Lastly, I would like to say the justification or the lack of moral correction into the issue of torture, unfortunately, in effect, says we have to suspend our morals and ethics in a time of conflict. This is exactly, if you listen, many of the evil, barbaric people or organizations like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, Boko Haram, just listen to some of their ideologues, like Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Many of them, they are very honest. They are not saying killing civilians is okay. They are not saying burning towns is okay. They are not saying hijacking planes. And they are not saying this is Islamically justifiable, because it's near impossible to justify even 1% of what they do. But what they are saying is, in a time of war and conflict, we have to have conditional ethics. We have to have conditional morals. In a time of where we are victim and people are attacking us, we have to suspend our morality. We have to suspend our moral ethical values. Any form or lack of action towards torture is basically patterning with these evil people and evil organizations. As a nation, we are not terrorist organization. We are not deeply broken economically, socially, and politically. We are in a position where we have to show, even in the time of conflict, even in the time of death and destruction, when we are provoked, we will act based on, they are not our teachers. We will act according to our moral ethical values, which are clearly outlined and identified in the foundational text and in the 200 and some years of this beautiful society. Let's not create excuses, which is worse than our crime. Let's not morally fail even deeper by not visiting these dark recent chapters of our collective life as Americans. Let's not morally sink even deeper by not addressing and correcting this moral failure which happened, specifically speaking, after 9/11. Thank you very much. And apologies for additional 3 minutes. If you put an evangelical pastor as my picture, I turn into Baptist preacher. I just can't help it.
Thank you, Abdullah, for the wonderful words. As a fellow Muslim American, I understand the difficulty it is communicating this, both overseas and domestically, about how this doesn't reflect really who America is, and not to take it as representative of our actions. But I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to any of the detainees or the people that have been released. But what can we do now to really try to heal that wound that has not really ever been addressed? Like, what can the U.S. government do, you think, or what can we put in our recommendations, aside from, saying that, loosely holding people that need to be held accountable? What other things can we do practically, directly with the Muslim communities so that they don't use this as a reason to fuel anti-Americanism, especially overseas?
Right. Thank you. You are asking the $1 million question. And I will give two set of answers, one broad. In the Nazi Germany, when Holocaust was happening, and when you go and try to understand like how something like this could happen, they always say, oh, this started in 1920s. No one can do what Nazis did to innocent people, especially 6 million innocent Jews, unless in the hearts and minds of that society or that continent, Judaism and Jews is collectively dehumanized. Collectively, for many Muslims, if they hear continuously dehumanization in the media, in the tweets of a president, in the church pulpit, in the organizational structure, so that distance between torture and that humanization that they are hearing over and over, for many Muslims, that distance is only 2 inches. That hurts so closely to one another, because you can't torture a human being unless, as a society, you sort of made them, in your own collective consciousness, less than human being, or you didn't collectively dehumanize. Like, there are a set of things that we can do as a society to make sure we understand the Islamic extremism, Islamic terror, Muslim terrorism, whatever you call it. But in our fight of that evil, in our fight of that ideology, A, we prove that we are any better. B, we just don't necessarily take that problem and generalize it as the war between Judeo-Christian West and Islam. Unfortunately, that irresponsible message is not helping us. We are losing our moral ground. Any highlight of that Islam is evil, Muslims are terrorists, especially when it comes from the irresponsible politician's mouth and tweets, it makes that impact much larger. There are things that we have to learn how to behave. It's been 16, 17 years, 9/11, the society has to recover and come back to its senses and address the issue much more sophisticated and savvy way. Secondly, the voices who are condemning and calling for a moral correction of torture has to be louder. We are not as loud as those people who are justifying. After I put my children in bed almost every morning, with the help of our law enforcement, I go to these online spaces where these evil organizations are trying to recruit people to terrorist organizations. If you look, their voice is louder. Unfortunately, we have to find out a way. People who are morally troubled, which is overwhelming majority, the problem is not those bad people doing torture, justifying torture. I think the real problem is us. The real problem is people who are morally completely troubled, but they cannot transform their moral trouble into constructive action. They cannot turn this into a moral movement. They cannot turn this into a moral awakening in their society as much as those crazies who are doing this or justifying this. Unfortunately, there is a lot more that we have to be self-critical as a people who are morally deeply troubled about this issue. Lastly, justice. Lastly, justice, and I think Canada and many other places are a lot more They are several steps ahead in the conversation, specifically on torture, in identifying the problem, holding those who are responsible, those who are perpetrators, and people who are in the higher command, order this, going after them, prosecuting them, and convicting them in the law, and giving them the kind of justice. Unfortunately, there is very little of that in American society. It's so sad that there are very few people, despite all the mountains of evidence against them, we were able to convict them and punish them, and then take that example to make sure their punishment will be a deterrent. So to heal morally, but also highlight it to the world that we are not like this.
Commissioner Boswell.
Yes, Dr. Antepli, thank you so much. My question is about religiously motivated acts of torture. And today we've heard a lot about different practices of torture that have been used during the rendition interrogation program. And one of the things, though, that I think we have not touched on enough is to go a little bit deeper into thinking through how certain practices that were utilized by interrogators had a particularly a deeper moral and spiritual and religious impact on the detainees, because they, for instance, nudity was one that was mentioned today, and of all the things that were done to this particular detainee, they focused on nudity. And I think sometimes as Westerners or non-Muslims, we look at that and we wonder, well, why was that more significant to that person than others? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about and parse a little bit for us about torture in general, and then parse down into some of the religious acts, how certain forms of torture, certain practices of torture have a deeper and more profound impact religiously and spiritually on Muslim detainees.
Thank you very much, and it's profoundly important and painful question. Religion can be a force for good and evil. As I said, no one can torture, no society can torture unless you collectively dehumanize that entity, unless you basically have no mercy left in your heart towards that particular people or that particular individual. And religion can be a force in dehumanization. I have seen this in my own community, in the Muslim community, many parts of the world that I fought and worked, how Islam, that gives me so much moral strength, that Islam that tried to make me in every step of the life, everything that I eat, I drink, I pray, makes me ethical more. But the same Islam becoming a force in dehumanizing large swaths of humanity, etc. And how certain teachings of any religion can be in that sense. Regretfully, answering your question directly, in the recent torture incidents, Christianity, Judeo-Christian values and symbols have been excessively and horrifically used. When I go to those sites where these Al-Qaeda or ISIS members are trying to recruit, remember the Abu Ghraib picture where those Muslim detainees are crucified or in that, using a Christian symbol and language. It is almost like the center of the recruitment propaganda, recruitment campaign, to tell them this is a crusade. This is another wave of crusaders coming to humiliate us, kill us. For again, many Westerners, when you talk about crusaders, it happened before Moses. They don't even bring it as close as to Jesus. But for many of us who grew up in the part of the world where these European colonialism was another crusades, and like the previous crusades, like many people in their perception in the Middle East, the creation of the state of Israel, unfortunately, in their perception, is another manifestation of Judeo-Christian religious, not economic, not political, but religious humiliation attack, annihilation attack to the dignity and honor of Islam. Unfortunately, it will take generations to remove those deeply burned Christian, Jewish images as these torturers torture the Muslim detainees, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Imam Antepli.